I am 75 years old. My name is Henry Cho. I almost didn't go that night. I had been working late all week at my uncle's restaurant in Koreatown, and I was tired, and my friend Danny had called me 3 times before I finally said yes. He had 2 tickets to the Tonight Show, and his wife didn't want to go, and he didn't want to go alone, and I said, fine, I will come, stop calling me. I was sitting in the 4th row when Clint Eastwood said what he said. I was in the corridor outside the backstage area 20 minutes after that when what happened. I have told pieces of this story over the years to people who mostly didn't believe me. I am telling all of it now because I am 75 years old and some things should be said while the people who saw them can still say them clearly.
The Tonight Show in the fall of 1973 was still the center of American television. Johnny Carson had been doing it for 11 years, and he had built something that no one else had been able to replicate, not because nobody tried, but because what he had built was inseparable from who he was, and nobody else was Johnny Carson. When you sat in that studio, you understood that you were inside something real, something that was happening now and would not happen this way again, and the 400 people around you all understood the same thing, and that shared understanding gave the room a quality that I have never fully been able to describe, but that I recognized again the moment I sat down in row 4 that night. Let me tell you who was in that building, because the combination of the 2 specific people who walked out through that curtain is what made the evening what it became. Clint Eastwood in 1973 was one of the biggest movie stars in the world. The Dollars trilogy, Dirty Harry, High Plains Drifter. He had built a persona across a decade of films that had become genuinely iconic. The squint, the drawl, the economy of motion, the sense of a man who would let silence do what other men used 1,000 words for. He was 43 years old, and he was at the absolute peak of what that persona could produce. Famous in the way that crosses cultural boundaries because the image is simple enough to translate into any language. He was also, and this matters for what happened later, genuinely confident in the way that men who have spent years being told they are the most dangerous thing in any room sometimes become, which is to say, confident in a way that had stopped being tested by circumstances a long time ago, and had therefore stopped being a quality that he monitored carefully. Bruce Lee, in 1973, was 3 months past the release of Enter the Dragon, and the world had just discovered him at scale. The decade of work, the students, the system, the teaching, all of it had been building toward a moment when the right film would reach the right number of people at the right time, and Enter the Dragon had been that moment. He was 32 years old, and he was navigating what it meant to go from being famous in specific rooms to being famous everywhere, simultaneously, which is a different experience, and not always a comfortable one. What had not changed, what could not be changed by any amount of fame, was what he actually was underneath all of it, which was a man who had spent 20 years building something real in the space between what he believed and what his body could do, and who knew, with the specific certainty that only that kind of work produces, exactly what that something was. These 2 men were going to sit on the same couch. My friend Danny, who had no particular knowledge of martial arts or film production dynamics, said when we sat down and looked at the program, "Well, this should be a good show." I agreed with him without knowing how much I was agreeing to. The show started at 8:30. Johnny's monologue was good that night, sharp, the room warm from the first minute, the kind of start that tells you everything is going to move well. He introduced Clint first. Clint came out, and the audience gave him the response that the biggest movie star in America got in 1973, which was immediate and enthusiastic, and had in it the specific quality of people recognizing someone they feel they already know because they have watched him be himself on screens for a decade. He sat down in the guest chair with the ease of a man who has been in front of cameras his whole adult life and has no relationship with self-consciousness about it. He was wearing a sport coat, dark, simple, the kind of thing that says, "I am not here to be looked at, I am here to be listened to," which in its own way was of course a thing that was very much designed to be looked at. Johnny and Clint talked for a few minutes about his recent films, about what he was working on, the easy warm-up of a talk show where the host and the guest know how the rhythm goes. Clint was good at this, in the way that very few people are good at it, giving enough to be interesting without giving so much that the interesting thing was gone. The audience liked him. He was easy to like from the outside. Then Johnny said, "I have another guest tonight who I think is going to make for a very interesting conversation. A man who I suspect approaches questions of confrontation and danger from a very different direction. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Lee." The curtain opened. The audience reacted the way audiences in 1973 reacted to Bruce Lee, which was with an immediacy and a warmth that had a different quality from the applause they'd given Clint. Not louder, not more enthusiastic, just different in the way that applause is different when people are responding to something they feel, rather than something they recognize. He walked out, and he moved the way he always moved. No performance of it, no adjustment for the cameras or the room, just a man going from behind a curtain to a chair with complete efficiency and no waste, and he shook Johnny's hand, and he sat down. He looked at Clint. Clint looked at him. I was in row 4 with a clear sightline, and what I saw between them in those first few seconds was an assessment. Mutual. Quick. The kind that two people do when they are each trying to understand what the other one is before the conversation tells them anything. I have thought about what that assessment must have looked like from the inside, from each of their positions, and I think the honest version of it is that Clint looked at a 140-pound man in a dark jacket and processed him through the categories available to him, and that Bruce looked at a 6-foot movie star with 40 years of physical confidence and processed him through different categories entirely. Neither of them said anything yet. Johnny filled the space the way he always did, finding the first question that would open something useful. He said, "Now I want to talk about something that I think is going to be interesting to the audience tonight, which is the question of confrontation. Both of you, in very different ways, have built careers around the idea of one man in a dangerous situation. But the tools you use and the philosophy behind them are completely different. Bruce, you've talked about Kung Fu, not just as a fighting system, but as something bigger than that. Can you explain that for the audience?" Bruce said, "Kung Fu at its deepest level isn't about fighting at all. The fighting is almost the smallest part of it. What it's actually about is the relationship between your mind and your body. The ability to be completely present in a situation, to see what's actually there, rather than what you expect to be there. The physical dimension is real, but it's a consequence of that other thing, not the point of it." Clint was listening. His expression was the expression he used for everything, the one that gave very little away and communicated attention without communicating what the attention was concluding. Johnny said, "Clint, you've built an entire persona around a different kind of confrontation, the man with the gun, the economy of violence, the idea that one tool in the hands of the right man ends the situation. Do you see a similarity between what Bruce is describing and what you've built?" Clint said, "I think they're completely different things. What Bruce is describing is a philosophy. What I've done in these films is tell stories about situations where the philosophy has to give way to the reality. When 5 men want to kill you, you don't have time for a state of mind. You have time for a tool that works." The audience received this warmly. Clint had said it lightly, easily, the delivery of a man who knows how to land a line in front of a crowd. Bruce said, "The state of mind and the tool that works aren't opposed to each other. The state of mind is what makes the tool effective. 2 men can have the same gun. The one who can be fully present in the moment, who can see the situation as it actually is, rather than as he's afraid it might be, that man is going to be faster and more accurate and going to make better decisions. The tool doesn't make the man makes the tool." Clint tilted his head slightly. He said, "That's a nice thought. I'm not sure it survives contact with reality." Bruce said, "What kind of contact?" Johnny leaned forward with the instinct of a host who sees something live and interesting developing. He said, "All right, I have to ask the obvious question then. Let's say you're in a situation, Clint. 5 bad guys, real situation, not a film. Would you rather have a revolver or 20 years of Kung Fu training?" The audience laughed, the comfortable laugh of people enjoying the setup. Clint said, without hesitation, "Revolver." More laughter. Clint said, "All due respect to Bruce here, and I mean that, but my revolver stops every single piece of Kung Fu and karate and whatever else you've got going on the moment it enters the conversation. A gun is a great equalizer. It doesn't care how fast you are, or how disciplined your mind is, or how many years you spent in a training hall. Physics doesn't have a philosophy." The audience laughed more, bigger this time. Johnny laughed. Clint had delivered it well, the tone of someone making an obvious point that the room was glad someone was finally saying. Bruce smiled. A small thing, brief, the smile of someone who has heard a version of this argument before and has an answer for it, and is deciding whether now is the right moment to give it. He said, "You're right, that a gun changes the equation. That's not in dispute. But the gun has to be in a situation, and the situation is managed by a mind, and the mind is what I'm talking about. 2 men with guns. One of them can be present, can read the situation before it becomes irreversible, can see the decision before it needs to be made. The other one can't. The gun doesn't change which one of those men survives." Clint looked at him. He said, "You know what I think?" Johnny said, with the slight alertness of someone who has just heard a tone shift. "What's that?" Clint said, "I think this is a very good story that sounds very convincing when no one is testing it. I think the philosophy is real in a training hall, and it's real in a film studio, where everything is choreographed and everyone knows their mark. And I think when it meets something genuinely uncontrolled, something that doesn't follow any pattern you've practiced, the philosophy goes out the window, and what you're left with is a small man who has never been in a real dangerous situation. The room shifted, not a dramatic shift, not the kind that produces noise right away. The quieter shift of 400 people processing a sentence that landed differently from the ones before it. Johnny said, "Now, Clint," Clint said, "I'm not being disrespectful. I'm saying what I actually think, which is that there's a version of martial arts that's a genuine combat system, and there's a version that's an extremely impressive performance, and I'm not sure, sitting here, which one I'm looking at. No offense." He said no offense the way people say no offense, which is as a signal that what follows it is in fact intended as offense. Bruce looked at him. The audience was quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a crowd watching entertainment, the uncertain quiet of a crowd watching something that has crossed a line they didn't see coming. Johnny was already recalibrating. You could see it in his posture, the subtle adjustment of a host who is preparing to manage something. Bruce said, "Which version do you think you're looking at?" Clint said, "Honestly, based on what I've seen in the films that have come out." He paused. Not for drama. For what felt like genuine consideration, though whether it was genuine or performed, I couldn't tell from row 4. He said, "You fight like you act." Silence. He said, "Which from everything I've watched you do is..." He looked out at the audience. The specific performer's move of including a room in a conclusion. Not your strongest skill. The room made a complicated sound. Not laughter. Not a gasp. Something between them. The noise of 400 people, unsure whether what they just heard was a joke or something else, and leaning towards something else. Johnny said immediately, "All right, let's." But Bruce spoke before Johnny could redirect. He said, "How many fights have you been in?" It landed clean, clear, without anger, which somehow made it hit harder than anger would have. Clint looked at him. For a moment, his expression shifted, something moved behind the controlled surface of it, and then it returned to what it had been. He said, "I've been in enough situations to understand the difference between skill and performance." Bruce said, "That wasn't the question." Johnny said, "Why don't we?" Bruce said, "The question was, how many fights you have actually been in. Not your characters, not the roles. You. Real situations with real consequences, how many? If you think that question was the moment things went sideways, what happened in the next 60 seconds will make the question sound like the easy part." Clint said, "I'm not going to answer that." Bruce said, "Because the number is low, or because the number is 0. The audience made a sound. Genuine this time. The kind that comes out of people before they decide what they think. Clint said, "I'm going to be honest with you. I'm sitting next to a man who has built a career on the idea that he's a serious fighter, and I've seen what that looks like. And I've been around people who are actually dangerous, actually trained, actually capable of the things they're supposed to be capable of, and the two things, the image and the reality, are very different." Bruce said, "I agree with you." Clint waited. Bruce said, "The image and the reality are very different. Which version do you think you represent?" Clint's jaw moved. Something had just happened in the conversation that had not gone the direction he expected it to go, and he was adjusting. His whole career, on screen and off, had been built around a particular dynamic, the one where he was the most dangerous thing in the room, and everyone understood that, including him. He had walked onto that stage with that dynamic intact, and it was now being questioned in a specific, patient, very public way by a man who had said almost nothing aggressive and was somehow winning the exchange. He said, "You know what? Let's stop dancing around it. I've been polite. I've said all due respect and no offense, and I've been careful about this. But let me just say directly what I think, which is that what you do is a show. It's a very good show. It's genuinely impressive, but it's not fighting, not real fighting. And I think you know that, and I think everyone in this room knows that, and I think we're all pretending otherwise, because you're famous, and because your movies are making a lot of money right now." The audience was silent. Johnny was off his chair, or nearly, the specific halfway rise of a host whose studio has just become something he needs to manage. He said, "We are going to take a quick break." Clint said, "I'm not done." Johnny said, "Clint," Bruce said, and his voice was very quiet, the specific quiet of a person who has decided that something has gone far enough. "What would it take to convince you?" Clint looked at him. Bruce said, "You've made a very specific claim about what I am and what I do. You've said it here, in front of this audience, on live television. What would change your mind?" Clint said, "Not a lot you can do on a talk show couch." Bruce said, "Then let's not do it on the couch." Johnny said, with complete conviction, "Nobody is doing anything anywhere. and we are going to a commercial break right now. The on-air light dropped, and what happened in the 90 seconds of that commercial break is something I watched from row 4 with the specific attention of a man who understood he was watching something unusual. Johnny was off his desk and at the couch in about 4 steps, faster than I had seen him move in the 2 times I'd attended the show. He spoke to Clint first, low and direct, the voice of a man who has been running this room for 11 years and is not pretending about what it requires right now. Clint sat with his arms crossed, listening, his expression not changing much. Then Johnny turned to Bruce. Whatever Johnny said, Bruce said something back, brief, and Johnny paused at it, and then said something else, and Bruce nodded, but in the specific way of someone who is agreeing to a process rather than an outcome. The production staff at the edges of the studio were moving. The segment producer was talking to someone off camera. 2 security people who had been near the stage entrance had shifted into a position that was subtly but visibly closer to the couch. Danny leaned over to me and said, "Are they actually going to fight?" I said I didn't know. The on-air light came back on. Johnny sat down and looked at both of them, and then at the camera, with the expression of a man who has made peace with whatever is about to happen, and has decided the only available strategy is to navigate it professionally. He said, "We are back." And I want to say that this is one of the more interesting conversations I've had on this stage, and by interesting, I mean that in the most sincere way possible. He paused. "Clint, I want to give you a chance to clarify something you said before the break, because I think it may have come out sharper than you intended." Clint said, "It came out exactly how I intended." Johnny blinked once. Clint said, "I said something honest. Bruce asked me to be direct, and I was direct. I think he's a talented performer who has built a successful image around the idea of being a martial artist. I think the image is genuine to a significant degree, and I think the actual combat application of what he does is significantly less proven than the image suggests. That's what I think, and I said it. I'm not going to walk it back because it made the room uncomfortable." Bruce said, "I appreciate that. I'd rather know what you actually think." Clint said, "That's what I actually think." Bruce said, "Then let me tell you something directly. Before the first film, I had been training every day for 15 years. I have students who are professional champions across multiple combat sports. I have developed a system that has been tested against real resistance in real contact training for over a decade. The films are what the public knows. What the films are built on is what I'm talking about." Clint said, "Students, training, system, those are all words for a controlled environment." Bruce said, "They are. You're right." Clint looked slightly surprised that Bruce had agreed. Bruce said, "The question is, what the controlled environment produces when the control is removed. And the answer to that question is not something you can determine from a couch." Clint said, "No, it isn't. A beat." Bruce said, "So." Clint said, "So." Johnny said, with the specific energy of a man who has just heard a starting pistol and is trying to get his body in front of something, "What I think we should do." Clint said, "There's a corridor behind this stage." Johnny said, "Nobody is going to any corridor." Clint said, "I'm not talking about fighting, I'm talking about a demonstration." Bruce says, "His training produces real results in uncontrolled situations. The corridor is uncontrolled, no marks on the floor, no camera angles, nobody calling action. Let's see what the training produces." The audience erupted, not in the clean way of a crowd responding to a planned moment, in the complicated way of 400 people who have just realized that 2 of the most famous men in American cinema are about to do something that was not on the program. Bruce stood up. He did not rush it, did not perform the standing, just stood, the way he did everything. Clint stood up. He was 3 inches taller and significantly heavier, and he stood with the physical ease of a man who has been the most physically imposing person in most rooms he'd entered for 20 years. Johnny was fully on his feet now, both hands on his desk, and he said in a voice that cut through the audience noise with the authority of 11 years of running this stage, "Both of you are going to sit back down, right now. We are on live television, and I am the host of this show, and what I am telling both of you is that nothing physical is going to happen on this stage or in any corridor connected to this stage." Neither of them sat down. Clint said something to Bruce that I couldn't hear from row 4. Bruce said something back. The audience was making enough noise that the words were lost, but not the tone, which was the tone of 2 men who had moved past the conversation and were deciding about the next thing. Security was moving. 3 people from the edges of the studio, 2 more from the stage entrance. Fred de Cordova was on the floor again, moving fast, the producer who has to stop the machine that he has been responsible for setting in motion. Johnny said, "One more time, I need you both to sit down, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Bruce said, and I heard this clearly because the audience noise had dropped as everyone tried to hear what was happening. "With respect, Johnny, I didn't start this." Johnny looked at Clint. Clint said, "I'll leave." He said it simply, not as an apology, not as a defeat, just as a decision, and he was already moving off the couch before the sentence was finished. And as he passed Bruce, something happened that I was close enough in row 4 to see clearly, even though I wasn't certain I was seeing it correctly. Clint's hand moved toward Bruce's chest. Not a punch, not a strike, more of the gesture of a man making a physical point, the kind of move that in any other context would be a push, a shove, the assertion of physical presence that men sometimes make when words have run out. It didn't land. Bruce had moved, the same small lateral shift I would later see described by people who had trained with him, the same quality of not being where the contact expected him to be, and Clint's hand found nothing, and his momentum carried him half a step in a direction he hadn't chosen, and one of Clint's bodyguards, a large man who had been positioned just off the edge of the stage and had moved toward the couch when things escalated, stepped forward. And that's when Bruce walked off the stage. Not away from the situation, through it. He walked directly toward the side entrance, and through it. And Clint followed, and 2 security people followed Clint, and 3 crew members followed all of them, and I followed the crew members. I have explained to people over the years that this was not a rational decision. I understand that following a famous movie star and a martial artist into a backstage corridor during an unscheduled physical confrontation is not the recommended behavior of an audience member. I did it anyway, because I was 25 years old, and something was happening that I understood in my body was important, and I wanted to see it. The backstage corridor at NBC Burbank connected to a staging area that I had been told by the man who sat next to me in row 4, who seemed to know a lot about the show's physical layout, was used for equipment storage. Large room, rubber floor, high ceiling, industrial lighting, the kind of space that exists in every television studio and that no viewer ever sees. That's where they went. By the time I made it to the entrance of that space, 6 people were already inside it, Bruce and Clint, and 2 of Clint's security, and 2 crew members who had been trying to stop things and had instead become spectators along with everyone else. I positioned myself at the doorway next to 2 other people who had followed. Clint's bodyguard, the large one who had moved toward the couch on stage, was in the center of the room. He was a substantial person, physically, the kind of person whose job requires a physical presence and who has cultivated that presence carefully. He said something to Bruce. I couldn't hear the exact words, but the tone was the tone of someone establishing authority through size, the specific communication of a man who has spent his career making rooms, understand that he is the most dangerous thing in them. Bruce looked at him, just looked. The bodyguard moved toward him. What happened in the next 5 seconds I am going to describe, as carefully and as accurately as I can, because I know how it sounds, and I know that the natural response to how it sounds is skepticism, and the only thing I can offer against that skepticism is that I was there, and I am telling you what I saw. The bodyguard was a big man, moving with real commitment toward a smaller man, not a formal technique, just the forward press of someone whose strategy is mass and momentum, the forward press that has probably worked in every situation this person has used it in, because mass and momentum work. They are real, they are not philosophy, they produce results. Bruce moved. It was not what I expected movement to look like. It was barely visible in the way that something very fast, that happens very close to you, is not always visible because your eye is still pointed at where the thing was when the movement started. He was somewhere different, and there was a contact. I saw the contact. A touch at the bodyguard's shoulder and something at his hip or thigh. A touch that cost Bruce nothing visible, no visible effort, no weight behind it, nothing that looked like a hit. The bodyguard sat down, hard. The sound of it in the staging area was the sound of a significant amount of mass meeting a rubber floor, and it bounced off the walls in a way that the 15 people in and around that room all heard clearly. He sat there for a moment. Then he looked up. Then he looked at his hands. The room was completely silent. If you think seeing the bodyguard go down was the peak of what happened in that staging area, what Clint Eastwood did next will tell you that it wasn't anywhere near the peak. Clint said, "Jimmy." He was looking at his bodyguard on the floor. Jimmy was already getting up. The automatic response of a professional who has been put down and is processing that fact while simultaneously returning to his feet. He was up in about 4 seconds, which was fast, and he stood and looked at Bruce with the specific expression of a man who is running a new calculation. Clint looked at Bruce. He said, "What did you do?" Bruce said, "He was moving forward. I redirected where the forward was going." Clint said, "You barely touched him." Bruce said, "I touched him at the right place, at the right time." The size difference is in your favor in a lot of situations. This is one of the situations where it isn't. Clint stood there, the body language of a man who is absorbing something real, the controlled surface of him, The thing that had been so present all evening was not gone, but it had moved slightly, the way a wall moves when you discover there's water behind it. He said, "Show me what you did." Bruce said, "Here?" Clint said, "Here." Everyone in the staging area exhaled, not as a decision, but as a body response to something that had just changed direction. Bruce looked at Clint for a moment. Then he said, "Put your hands on my shoulders. Push. Whatever you've got." Clint looked at him. He looked at the people around the room. Then he stepped forward and put his hands on Bruce's shoulders and pushed. Clint Eastwood was a large man, and he was pushing with the kind of effort that large men, who have spent their whole careers being the strongest thing in the room, bring to something like this, which is real effort, genuine, not held back. Bruce did not move. Not back. Not sideways. He absorbed it the way a tree absorbs wind, by being so rooted that the force doesn't have anywhere to go except back to where it came from. Clint pushed harder. Nothing. And then something happened that was smaller than what had happened with the bodyguard, but was somehow more significant, at least to the people watching, at least to me in that doorway. Bruce's hip moved, 3 inches, a rotation, barely visible, and Clint's push, the same push with the same force behind it, suddenly had nowhere to go. The angle had changed, and Clint stumbled forward, not hard, not down, just half a step in a direction he hadn't chosen. He caught himself. He straightened. He looked at Bruce. Bruce said, "Your strength is real. 6'2", 200 pounds. Whatever you were putting into that push was real. The only thing I changed was the angle it met." Clint said nothing for a moment. He said, "Do the thing you did to Jimmy." Bruce said, "I'm not going to put you on the floor." Clint said, "Why?" Bruce said, "Because that would be the end of a conversation I think we're in the middle of." Clint looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the people around the room shifted slightly, the physical response of people who are waiting for something. Then Clint said, "What you're describing, the angle, the timing, not meeting force directly, that's what you were talking about on the couch, the state of mind that changes the situation before it becomes about strength." Bruce said, "Yes." Clint said, "And you've been doing this for how long?" Bruce said, "Since I was a child." "Seriously, for 20 years. Clint said, 20 years. He said it not as a question, not as a challenge, more as someone setting a measurement down next to something else and seeing how they compare. He said, "What I said out there, on the stage." Bruce waited. Clint said, "I said, you fight like you act," which I said badly. Bruce said, "How did you mean it?" Clint said, "I meant I couldn't tell from the outside whether what you were showing was real, whether the confidence was built on something, or whether it was the role." Bruce said, "And now," Clint said, "now I know it's built on something." He paused. "That doesn't mean what I said wasn't wrong. It was wrong." The staging area was very quiet. Clint said, "I owe you an apology." Bruce said, "You said what you believed." Clint said, "I said what I assumed, which is different. I assumed because of how things look, rather than what they are, which is exactly what I accused you of." That sentence landed in the room like something that had been true for a while and had just finally been said. Jimmy, who had been standing off to the side of the room since getting up from the floor, said something under his breath that I didn't catch. The 2 crew members near the far wall were watching without speaking. Bruce said, "The films create a perception problem. I know that. The public version of me is built from what shows up on screen, and what shows up on screen is designed for cameras, not for accuracy. That gap between the image and the reality is something I've been dealing with for a long time." Clint said, "But the reality is," Bruce said, "the reality is what you just felt. And what Jimmy felt, which isn't about me being special. It's about 20 years of doing one thing every day without stopping." Clint said, "Most people spend 20 years talking about doing one thing." Bruce said, "Yes." Clint was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something. What I do, the roles, the persona, the whole Dirty Harry thing, is there anything real in it, from where you stand?" Bruce thought about it, genuinely thought, not performing the consideration. He said, "The economy of it is real. The idea that the smallest necessary motion is the right motion. That's something I've spent 20 years trying to understand, and you put it on screen in a way that millions of people understood intuitively, without being able to name it. That's not nothing." Clint said, "But," Bruce said, "but the gun makes the economy theatrical, rather than practical. Because the gun is the answer to every question before the question is asked. When you always have the answer, you don't have to develop the ability to find it." Clint looked at him for a long moment. He said, "That's the most interesting thing anyone has said to me in a year." Something in the room shifted. The tension that had been building since the stage had not disappeared, but it had changed character, the way weather changes when the front moves through, and the air after it is different from the air before. Bruce said, "Clint." Clint looked at him. Bruce said, "Come to my school, not for a demonstration, not to see something impressive. Come to work. Come for a week, and do what my students do, and see what happens after a week." Clint studied him. He said, "You'd teach me." Bruce said, "I'd give you access to what the training actually is. What you do with it is your business." Clint said, "I'm filming in 6 weeks." Bruce said, "6 weeks from now, do you want to be the same or different?" The question hung in the air. Clint almost smiled. A small thing, brief. He said, "I'll think about it." Bruce nodded. The small, clean nod. Fred de Cordova appeared in the doorway behind us, having tracked down where everyone had gone. He said, "I need both of you back on the stage. We have 2 minutes of segment left, and Johnny would like to close professionally." Both of them looked at him. Fred said, "Please." They went back. I made it back to my seat about 30 seconds before the on-air light came back on. Danny said, "Where did you go?" I said, "Backstage." He said, "You went backstage?" I said, "Yes." He said, and I said, "I'll tell you in the car." Johnny wrapped the last 2 minutes with the skill that 11 years of live television produces in a person, finding a frame for the evening that made it feel like something that had resolved rather than something that had been interrupted. He asked both of them something forward-looking, something about what they each had coming up, giving them the opportunity to say something clean and professional for the cameras. Clint said something about a picture he was developing. Bruce talked about what he was trying to do next. They looked at each other. At one point, when Johnny was making a joke about something, I saw them look at each other the way two people look at each other when something private has happened that the room doesn't know about and that neither of them is going to mention on camera. The show went to credits. The audience filed out slowly, talking, the specific quality of an audience that doesn't want to fully leave yet, because leaving means it's over. Danny drove home, and I told him everything. He said, "The bodyguard actually sat down." I said, "Yes." He said, "From that little thing Bruce did." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Did Clint actually apologize?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Out loud." I said, "Yes." He said, "Clint Eastwood." I said, "Yes." He drove for another minute in silence. Then he said, "Good thing I called you 3 times. Bruce Lee died 4 months after that evening. He was 32 years old. I heard the news on the radio, and I pulled over. I just pulled over and sat in my car for a while. I thought about the staging area, about Jimmy going down, about Clint's push meeting, the 3-inch hip rotation, and going sideways. About Bruce saying the smallest necessary motion is the right motion, and that the gun is the answer to every question before the question is asked, and that when you always have the answer, you don't develop the ability to find it. I have thought about those sentences for 50 years. I will probably think about them for whatever years are left. I was in row 4, and then I was in that corridor, and I saw all of it. I have told pieces of it to people over the years, and mostly they nodded politely and changed the subject. Telling the whole thing has taken me 50 years to get around to. Some things are worth telling, while the person telling them can still remember clearly. This is one of them. That's the whole story.